Imagine walking through a bustling Victorian marketplace, the air thick with the scents of fresh bread, coal smoke, and chatter. Stalls overflow with colorful fabrics and fragrant spices, while townsfolk haggle loudly, weaving through the crowd. Amid this lively scene, your eyes catch something unsettling. A woman standing with a ribbon tied tightly around her neck, not a customer, but an object of trade. Nearby, her husband calls out a price, negotiating her sale as if she were livestock. It's a shocking image, almost unbelievable, yet wife-selling was a grim reality in 18th and 19th century England. Why would a husband sell his wife? The answer lies in a complex web of social, economic, and legal constraints. For the working class, formal divorce was prohibitively expensive and legally restrictive, leaving few options to end unhappy or untenable marriages. Wife-selling emerged as a desperate, informal solution to this problem. An underground market where husbands could transfer their wives to another man, often with the wife's reluctant consent or in the hopes of escaping debt, cruelty, or infidelity. Though it sounds like fiction, this practice was surprisingly widespread and documented across Victorian England, revealing a stark contrast between the era's genteel ideals and the harsh realities of working-class life. This glimpse into the past exposes how societal limitations forced people into extraordinary and often tragic choices. In Victorian England, marriage was much more than a personal relationship. It was a strict legal contract that shaped the lives and rights of both spouses, especially women. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was essentially absorbed into her husband's. Property she owned before marriage automatically became his, and she had little to no control over finances, decisions, or even her own body. This legal doctrine, known as coverture, meant that wives had almost no autonomy and were entirely dependent on their husbands for economic security and social status. Divorce, while technically possible, was an extraordinary and often unattainable solution for those seeking to end a marriage. For the upper classes, divorces required acts of parliament, an expensive, lengthy, and public ordeal, while for others, separation through the church was the only alternative. Both paths were costly, time-consuming, and deeply stigmatized. Because of these barriers, many couples who found their marriages intolerable were trapped in unhappy or even abusive unions with no legal way out. Victorian society also offered women minimal legal protections. They had limited rights to property, custody of children, or personal safety from a cruel spouse. Social norms reinforced women's subservience, and legal systems largely ignored their welfare once married. The strictness of marriage laws left many working-class people with a harsh choice: remain bound to a failing marriage or resort to informal, extra-legal solutions. This legal and social landscape created the conditions for wife-selling, a desperate but socially recognized workaround. Although it was never formally legal, the practice gained a form of community acceptance as a way to dissolve marital ties when formal divorce was out of reach. Husband and wife would appear in public markets or fairs, and the husband would symbolically auction the wife to a new man, effectively transferring responsibility and control. While morally controversial, wife-selling provided an alternative path for separation in a society where legal options were closed to most. This practice highlights the tension between rigid laws and human needs, revealing the lengths to which people went to reclaim some agency in their personal lives. Wife-selling was a bizarre and striking ritual that took place in public marketplaces, taverns, or courthouse steps across Victorian England. The spectacle typically involved a husband leading his wife, often with a ribbon, rope, or halter tied loosely around her neck or waist, symbolizing her status as an item for sale. Despite its unsettling appearance, this was not a legal transaction. No courts or law officials sanctioned it, but rather a public declaration that the marriage was effectively over in the eyes of the local community. The ribbon or halter was deeply symbolic. It was not meant to physically restrain or humiliate the wife, but to signal her availability for transfer. In many ways, the act echoed the sale of livestock or goods in the marketplace. But here it served as a public performance announcing the end of marital obligations and the beginning of a new arrangement. The setting mattered greatly. Public venues such as market squares or taverns ensured witnesses could confirm the transaction, providing social legitimacy where legal recognition was absent. Typically, the husband would call out bids from onlookers, and the highest bidder, often a new lover or an acquaintance willing to take responsibility for the wife, would purchase her. Sometimes the buyer was already living with the woman, making the ceremony a formal acknowledgement rather than an actual sale. Public notices or announcements might accompany the ritual, further embedding it in community awareness. This blend of theatricality and practicality made the practice both a spectacle and a solution. Women's roles in these events varied. Some actively participated, choosing their buyers or consenting to the sale as a way to escape abusive or unhappy marriages. Others refused bids, and in some cases, wives were reluctant participants forced into the ritual by their husbands' financial or social pressures. Despite the seeming indignity, wife selling could offer a form of agency and social recognition otherwise denied to them by the law. Historical accounts reveal the ritual's complex nature. In one case, a wife was sold for a few shillings in a bustling market, while in another, a well-known tavern auction drew a crowd eager to witness the event. These instances highlight how wife-selling blended elements of community spectacle, practical separation, and desperate survival in an era when formal divorce was nearly impossible. Through this ritual, working-class people negotiated the rigid confines of Victorian marriage and sought a form of freedom, however flawed and unofficial. Wife-selling was more than just a practical solution. It was a spectacle that drew crowds from villages and towns, turning marketplaces and taverns into stages of suspense and drama. On some occasions, the gatherings were so large that sales had to be postponed, with onlookers buzzing with curiosity and excitement. People came not only to witness the ritual, but to take part in the negotiations, creating a charged atmosphere that blurred the lines between community event and personal tragedy. Many of these sales were the result of mutual agreements. Some couples, trapped in unhappy marriages but unable to divorce legally, used wife selling as a peaceful and cooperative way to separate. In such cases, the ritual served as a public acknowledgement of the end of their relationship, allowing both parties to move on with some degree of dignity and community recognition. The wife might even have a say in who would buy her next, often a trusted friend or lover, making the process more consensual than it appeared at first glance. However, not all stories ended so amicably. Conflict and jealousy frequently erupted during these sales. One famous case involved a shopkeeper who tried to sell his wife after discovering her with another man. The public nature of the sale amplified the personal betrayal, turning a private dispute into a community spectacle. Such events often stirred heated arguments and sometimes violence, underscoring the fragile and volatile nature of these unofficial transactions. Wife selling also had a darker side. Not all women were willing participants. Some were sold without consent, victims of their husband's desperation or cruelty. Regret, shame, and tragedy often followed these forced sales, highlighting the precarious position of women in Victorian society. The public display of a wife's sale could lead to social ostracism and emotional trauma, with limited options for recourse. Notable cases from history reveal the range of experiences within this practice. John Osborne, for instance, made headlines when he sold not only his wife, but also their child inside a crowded tavern, shocking onlookers and stirring outrage. Another remarkable story from 1824 describes a woman who rejected a high bid from a prospective buyer and demanded a second auction, asserting her agency even within the confines of this unusual ritual. Her refusal to accept the first sale challenged the usual dynamics of wife selling, hinting at the complex negotiations of power and consent behind the scenes. Beyond the spectacle, These events were deeply emotional for the individuals involved. Behind the public performances were real people grappling with pain, hope, and survival. Wife selling was not merely a bizarre custom. It was a desperate act born out of rigid laws, social constraints, and the yearning for freedom in an unforgiving world. These stories remind us of the human cost behind what might seem like a strange historical curiosity, revealing the resilience and vulnerability of those caught in the harsh realities of Victorian marriage. Despite its unofficial and illegal status, wife selling often gained a surprising level of community recognition. Local populations frequently accepted the practice as a practical, if imperfect, way to end marriages when legal divorce was out of reach. The public nature of the ritual created a form of social acknowledgement, effectively signaling to neighbors and creditors that the husband no longer claimed responsibility for his wife. In many cases, townsfolk treated the transaction as legitimate enough to affect everyday dealings. This was reflected in public announcements that sometimes accompanied wife sales. For instance, it was common for sellers to issue warnings advising local shopkeepers and lenders not to extend credit to the sold wife or her new husband, effectively protecting themselves from unpaid debts. These disclaimers highlighted the transactional aspect of the ritual and the desire to formalize the separation within community networks, even without legal backing. Payments were often made not just in coins, but also in ale, emphasizing the important role tavern culture played in wife selling. Taverns and pubs served as central social hubs where much of this informal business was conducted, blending social interaction with practical arrangements. The exchange of money alongside rounds of ale reflected the performative and communal nature of the sales, reinforcing bonds within working-class communities while addressing individual marital problems. The persistence of wife selling can be attributed to this blend of social necessity and tolerated illegality. For many working-class couples, the practice provided a rare avenue for separation, circumventing the legal system that was expensive, restrictive, and biased against women. Although authorities occasionally condemned or prosecuted wife selling, enforcement was sporadic, and the practice endured precisely because it fulfilled a pressing social need. However, the practice began to decline in the late 19th century as changes in law and society gradually offered better protections and rights to women. Legal reforms made divorce more accessible, while women gained increased property rights and legal recognition, reducing the need for extra-legal solutions. Additionally, growing public disapproval and shifting social attitudes toward marriage and gender roles contributed to the ritual's eventual disappearance. Ultimately, wife selling stands as a poignant example of how communities navigated rigid social and legal constraints, adopting creative, if controversial, practices to address deeply personal issues. Its slow decline marked not just the end of a peculiar custom, but the beginning of a more just and equitable era for marriage and women's rights. The image of a woman being sold in a public marketplace, a ribbon tied loosely around her neck, her fate auctioned before a crowd, shocks the modern mind. At first glance, wife selling appears cruel, dehumanizing, and surreal. Yet, beneath its unsettling surface lies a complex and desperate response to the harsh realities faced by working-class people in Victorian England. With legal divorce costly and nearly impossible, and women denied autonomy or protection under the law, wife selling became a practical, if unofficial, way to break free from untenable marriages. This practice starkly reveals the social and legal limits placed on personal freedom during the era. It exposes a world where laws favored property and patriarchal control over individual rights, forcing people into extraordinary measures to claim some agency. Wife selling is a vivid testament to how deeply marriage was embedded in economic and social structures, rather than solely a private union of love and partnership. As the marketplace emptied and the woman walked away, whether into freedom or further hardship, the scene invites us to reflect on the nature of marriage, rights, and society itself. What does it mean when the law fails its people and informal customs emerge in its place? How far will individuals go to reclaim control over their lives? This glimpse into the past challenges us to consider the ongoing struggle for justice, equality, and dignity within our most intimate relationships.